So in our summer of workflow that we're doing, we're now looking at part 4, some of the advanced functions for workflow. And this is going to be getting some of the more esoteric parts of the workflow, but it's really some powerful functions based on use cases. And it's where when I'm helping people to understand how to use FileHold and FileHold's workflow module, I like to take a deep dive into the use case. And here we're really going to be doing a deeper exploration of some of that. So understanding what you need workflow to do will bring out some of these functions for you. Now, I want to give a quick recap because we are in session 4 of 6, so let's make sure we understand where, how we got to where we are today. So far, we've configured our workflow settings, we built our workflow template, we've assigned review and approval activities to different users, we've attached the template to a schema, initiated and completed our demo workflow, explored some of our essential status report tools, and now it's time to take a look at some of the exceptions to a workflow, some of the things that can really help you to customize and make this process work for you. We're going to start with probably the most difficult concept in this, which is the postpone workflow. So all your documents and records in FileHold have a workflow status. Even if you don't have the workflow module, if you're just attending this to learn a little bit more about how workflow functions and if that's a module you want to consider investing into with your FileHold licensing, absolutely. All your documents, including the ones you have in there right now, have a workflow status, and that will be not submitted for approval, has yet to go through a workflow process, pending approval, currently undergoing a workflow, and waiting for the result of that, approved, it has completed its workflow and been signed off on, or not approved, it's gone through its process and been rejected. What happens if there's nothing wrong with the document, but it cannot be approved or rejected right now? This is where our postpone function comes into this. So postpone allows users to add a fifth stage. The activity cannot be completed now, but it will be in the future. So we are opening up the possibility of delaying or postponing our workflow until we get to the future. So there are 3 postponed states that we want to take a look at today. Create an ad hoc review activity. So if you want to, so if you want to delay it, you can create an ad hoc review to send it to somebody else. We can return to initiator, or we can return to a prior activity. Let's take a deeper dive into each one of those and also talk about some of the use cases. And we'll start with our create an ad hoc review activity. So this creates a one-time review to send to another FileHold user. So it's not another approval activity, it's a review activity that you're sending to other users. So you're not delegating your approval, you're asking for someone to review something. And our use case for this, you have an SOP or a standard operating procedure that you want legal to review before you can approve. The ad hoc review activity is now part of the workflow audit record. So unlike just sending an email to somebody and saying, hey, is this everything good in this? You can actually log it as part of your workflow activity. And just as a note, it does need to be another FileHold user. So I can't just send this to a random person. It needs to go to another user for the workflow activities. The next one we might look at is return to initiator. So we send the document or record back to the initiator of the workflow for further action. And our example here is we have an invoice that we've received for a shipment, but we've received the invoice before the shipment itself. So we ordered some goods. We've just received an order. We've received our invoice for it. I don't have the goods yet. So approving the document is not appropriate because approving triggers payment, and we don't want to pay until we receive the goods and confirm that everything's valid onto there. Not approved is also not appropriate because we don't want to reject the document because the invoice might be just fine. We just don't have the goods yet. So here I might want to pause the invoice until the goods are received by returning it to the workflow initiator, sending it back to the person who first kicked it off. Return to prior activity is where I can send it to a previously determined activity within the sequence. So here we send the document or record back to a prior activity of the workflow for further action. We're asking someone to take further activity on it. And here our use case is we have a multi-step workflow. At the final approval, a typo is noticed and the document needs to be corrected. The first activities are not to be reapproved, but the final 3 do. So the document is sent back to, say, for instance, activity 7, they correct the error, and now we complete our workflow from that step moving forward. If I cancel the workflow or if I mark it as not approved and put it through a new workflow process, I have to start from the beginning. This allows me to return to a previously determined step because that's a point where the approval started to happen. So maybe I have a dozen review activities first, and then I have approval activities afterwards. I don't need to do those review activities again potentially. So I want to make sure that that typo is corrected and just get the final sign-offs done. So it's that last chance to do a pass back. And there's lots of use cases for where we might want to use those. All right. Let's take a dive now into FileHold and start actually taking a look at some of these functions practically. So let me just open up my, oops, didn't mean to open that up. Let's close that, sorry. I'm using a compacted screen, so it's kind of giving me some impact there. Good. So I've opened up the web client. Today we're going to use our web client to take a look at this, and we can see some of my different workflow templates. Let's talk about how I might initialize using a postpone process. So we'll go into the same workflow template we've been using so far, so our invoice approval, and let's edit this template so we can get into our settings here. And we'll notice that over here, I do not have a postpone option that's available, and that's because this is a review activity. So my postpone activities are only available on approval activities. So I can, if I'm approving, I need to actually sign off on that process by entering my my password into the system in order to verify that I want that to happen in the document. So because my second activity here is an approval, I can open this up and say allow approval, allow postpone approval. I check that, refreshes the page. I just need to scroll back down now and go back to my allow postpone approval, select one or more steps to restart from, and I can click my three dots on the end, and it's going to present me with my three options. So allow participant to create a one-time review. So this would allow me to route it to somebody. My next one, return to workflow initiator, usually checked by default, but I could enable or disable that. And then a prior step of activity attached to PO. We're not saying the document must be postponed when we use this. We're just saying that it's an option that the user could select. So if 99% of the time they're just moving it to the next phase, then we can absolutely leave it at here too. And this is allowing them to do that 1% exception. And that's why we're looking at some advanced functions. These are not required. These are just options that the user can initiate when they're dealing with a document going through a workflow. So I'm going to say OK to that. Takes me back to my prior screen. Let's go down now to activity 3. And again, if I click the allow postpone approval and then head back down to then click on my three dots, we have four options now: allow participant to create a one-time review, return to workflow initiator, and then the two prior steps of activity. So in this case, I don't want this to come back to the person who's doing the PO. I want this only to go back to the person who's approving the expense. And here I don't want to allow the return to workflow initiator, but I will allow a one-time review activity. Now with that built into the template, when I route this document through workflow, it means that the user will have that as an option they can choose. Once a document becomes postponed in the workflow, we can then restart the workflow later when our appropriate action has been done. I create a one-time review activity, the review is returned to me, I restart the workflow. I route it back to the workflow initiator. The workflow initiator completes the activity they need to as requested with the postponement. They then route it back by restarting the workflow using the workflow status report. You may remember that from our last session. We're looking at the workflow status report. So this is how we can utilize postpone and build it into the workflow template to allow it or not allow it. You could also say, I'm not dealing with situations where my workflow needs that postponement. Don't enable it then. You'll see that it's an optional feature in the activity. It's not enabled by default. I have to choose it into here to allow postpone approval. So I have these four states of being, and if I want to introduce that fifth state to my workflow, I can do that with this tool. Now we're not using the, when it comes to advanced functions, I want to explore some of the other subjects here today. So one of the ones we're not going to cover today is convert main documents to PDF. That's going to be covered in full in session 6 when we're going to talk about sign-off sheets, because sign-off sheets is one of the easiest way to capture that information from the sign-off sheet and have it as part of the document's workflow. So we're going to look at that one later. We're going to spend some time now. I'm going to go back up to the very top here and talk about our top section of this, which are our global settings for the workflow. And I'm actually going to start from, I'm going to go in reverse order from bottom to top on this. So our first one here is observers. Who do I want to set as an observer to the workflow? Who do I want to be able to see this workflow go through the process? Observers are someone who can see the workflow status report, who will get emails when a workflow has been completed or when it's been restarted. So you get those notifications, but they don't get notices at kickoff. They get notices when the workflow is finished or when workflows have been delayed. They're an observer. The idea is that an observer doesn't need to know when things start. They need to know when things end. So they can go in and look at the status report if they need to. Observers can also go in at any time and look at things that are happening in their workflow status report. We'll talk about that again in a second. We'll go back over to the status reports before we're done here today. So I also want to talk about querying the status reports and how we can get that information out. When it comes to an observer, we're usually talking about someone who's a manager within a department who needs visibility to those workflow functions, but they don't need day-to-day notifications coming through letting them know that things have started. They just need to know when there's issues with them. They're an observer within the process. We can also allow the document version owner to observe by default, so that if I'm the owner but I'm not a participant in the workflow, I can also get those same notifications. Next section up here, email notifications. How are we letting people know that something is about to become overdue? Now, one of the things we often get asked about is how we escalate within workflow. And we do that through notifying people, let them know a task is now overdue, and we're keeping a timer under that as it goes. This is a courtesy thing that we can do to send out, let someone know, hey, something is going to be overdue. We often see this with extended deadlines. You may create a workflow task, for example, that has a 90-day time limit on it. And that 90 days is there because if there's a compliance issue that says they have 90 days to complete this. It might be a courtesy then to say that I want to notify someone at the 10-day mark beforehand that the task is going to be overdue. And then I could even repeat that notification. So in this case, every 72 hours, so they get continued notices coming back to say, hey, this is going to be overdue. You might want to take action onto this. It's a nice friendly reminder that we can build into that as part of the workflow process. Now, if I'm giving someone 24 hours to complete something, I certainly don't need to give them a reminder, typically speaking, because they'll have that attention by the workflow task having been assigned to them. So we're dealing with extended workflows or longer periods of time. This is a very useful tool to allow me to do some of those activities to it. The next one up is probably, I think, one of the best tools to use to be able to show that something has been approved. And this is convert main documents to electronic records at completion. So this comes back to the idea of what approval really means on a document. I have a document, I run it through FileHold, it's now marked, or run it through FileHold's workflow. When it's finished, I then look at it and I say, this document has been approved. I've signed off on this. This has been completed. At that state, somebody could still check that document out. If they do check that document out, they can modify it. Once they check in a new version of that, the prior workflow status is lost. Now, we saw in our last session that we can put the settings onto it when we configure our workflow so that we can restart a workflow automatically once it's been checked back into the system. And that's a great tool because it does allow me to then, proactively interact with that document and make sure that any of those changes that have happened go through a workflow process again. But sometimes you're not dealing with something where you actually want them, where you want a change to be allowed. Hey, this is a document and it's checked out, or you could check it out until it goes through its workflow. Once it completes that workflow cycle, we can finish that. By using this, I can have my main documents, remember not supporting documents, my main document marked as a record once it completes its workflow cycle. And that's an extremely useful tool. So I personally love that one because it really shows that this has been marked as a record. Now remember, marking a document as a record does not change the format of the document. It's not like converting it into a PDF. We saw that tool down below that does actually convert and create a new version of the document. What this does is it simply turns our document into a record, which means that a FileHold user cannot modify it. They can still download it. They can still access local copies of it. They could even add a modified version as a new document within FileHold, but they cannot modify it once it's been declared a record. Incidentally, Workflow is a great tool that allows a user to convert documents to records. You might have a process in place where you say, I want a user to be able to declare documents as records, but I don't want them to be an administrator. As it stands, only a cabinet administrator or greater can convert documents to records when they own the cabinet where those documents reside. That might be too much role to give someone, because for example, you don't want them to be able to delete content. You can create a workflow that's basically convert document to record. And we have that engaged, and the person says approved, and then you have a user signing off to say this can now be converted to record. And that's the only thing the workflow is doing. And it seems limited, but it's actually a really powerful tool because it allows me to tag that document and process that information against it. So again, something highly recommended to embrace for this is the ability to make that conversion. Hide the document version until the workflow is approved. This is the exact same thing that we saw when we were looking at the schema template for it. Let me just show you that to you. So let's go over to our document schemas. That'll take a second to load. There it is. Let's take a look at any one of these that might have a workflow associated with it. Doesn't matter which schema. And here it is down here, hide versions of the document in the schema until the document has been approved. So that gives us that same tool right over here to hide the document versions. We can do that at the schema level. So here it means that once we turn this on, any approval activity can mark the document as approved. So I could have multiple approval schemas attached to this, and then the one that I'm using will hide the version until it's been approved. Now let's go back and take a look at my workflow templates, and let's go and take a look at our DMS workshop. So I didn't save my changes, that was deliberate. We've got our hide the document version until the workflow is approved. So I could have, approval process 1, approval process 2, approval process 3 is the final one. And that's the one where I hide iterations of it until the document has been approved. So by adding this template to it, I automatically hide the document. Only that one workflow cycle will have that document marked as approved. So it's a way of locking the approval to the workflow template. Where you need to hide things until approved, this is extremely useful. Think again of those standard operating procedures. I might have a change in the procedure. The existing procedure is acceptable. The new one needs a greater level of review. So while I'm working on the new versions of that SOP, I want people to use the existing SOP. I can hide the versions that I'm generating through workflow, through the iteration process of checking in, checking out, and making modifications of documents. Once all that is complete, I can then release that once the approval is done and the workflow releases the document. And now it was version 1, now it's version 27 because it's gone through 26 iterations of that to get to 27, and the user didn't see any of that and they can't see any of the prior versions because they're all hidden until approved. So hide the document version until the workflow is approved, extremely powerful function. Reset all activities when adding documents or checking in new document versions to a postponed workflow. This is disabled by default, and it's only used where it's important that we actually start back at the beginning of a workflow process once that a delay has been put into there. So for example, if I route this back to the workflow initiator as my postponement activity, then when I restart the workflow, it should pick up from my step where I sent it back to the person. By using this, it'll put it back to activity 1. Now, why is that important? In some processes, you may need to start over by regulatory obligation. So we may say that we need all the sign-offs redone once that postponement's been put into place. This is a legal mechanism. You may never use this. In fact, I see this used rarely, but it's nice to know that it's there just in case I have one of those processes. And our last one here is really significant. Initiator can modify this workflow, add, edit, or delete activities at initiation. This makes the entire workflow, so I'll go back into my editing mode here. This makes the entire workflow plastic. It means that I can add activities, I can remove activities, and I can edit any aspect of an activity once I go into this. It turns anyone who initializes the workflow into a super user. Now, I would only use this in a situation where I had extremely confident and skilled workflow operators. I wouldn't use this for the average user who will never need to know how to sculpt a workflow, how to do some of these creation points on it. Their role in the workflow is only going to be as a user. They're going to be initializing workflows that someone else has done. If they understand what these differences in the setting mean, such as what it means to actually hide the document version until it's been approved, or what it means to add a postponement activity, then absolutely you can use this. But it turns anyone who initializes it into a super user. And my second caveat on this is I would never use this for a controlled process. If I have a controlled process of documentation, if I have something where I need to, make sure that there is legal process that has been applied against a document, I will want to keep very distant from how the initiator can modify that workflow activity, because I could potentially remove key elements from that workflow and still have it marked as approved. And remember, users don't see the individual activities in the sign-off sheet. They simply see that it's been approved. So they wouldn't know that the workflow template was modified. If I'm asking someone to edit a document that's going to be, used for an internal HR manual, that's one thing. That's not going to be as, legally binding. If I'm doing a press release that's going out, hey, the ability, to, make those changes again, not hugely impactful. If I'm creating a new standard operating procedure, I do not want someone to modify those activities. So I'm going to be very tightly controlled over how I want those that initiator to modify that template. So again, something we want to be careful of. So that covers all of the core advanced settings that we have for in the software. Now, there's a bunch of stuff that I haven't covered here today when it comes to configuration, such as using our workflow extender plugin, which allows us to do customizable programming to do actions that go above and beyond what we've seen today. We're not going to be talking about those in these sessions because it's purely customization. And if you have a use case where there's something you haven't seen here that you want to be able to do, you can let us know. We do have some published use cases for the extender plugin on our website under the professional services page. So if you're interested in seeing those, I highly recommend checking those out. I will share that in a couple moments where you can find that link to it. But again, it's another resource that you can use to find some of that information onto there. All right. Let's take a look at some of the other reporting tools that I didn't cover last time. At least I don't think I did. I probably didn't, so let's just double check and make sure. So I'm going to go into my full administration menu. Remember, all of your full users have access to this menu because only a full user can be a participant in a workflow. So therefore, they'll have access to the administration menu. They may not see all of the options I'm going to show you, but they will see some of them. I'm going to start with the workflow dashboard, and this is an example of the workflow dashboard. So all users have instance of this. By default, it shows us the last 3 months worth of workflow activities. So you can modify this to be able to see any of those. You can also include any of the due dates that when they're overdue, so we can also capture things that may have been missed in the system. We got a pie chart down here, and you can see when I move my mouse over top, different wedges pop out, and it shows you what it's referencing. So in this case, there was an application for employment workflow. We had one of those go through, so it's a thin wedge of the pie. Up here, we have the application for employment, not overdue, not active, not postponed. It was canceled. So I can see that as an action in there, one action in there. So I can see my canceled workflows, my completed workflows. They all become part of the same process. So in this case, last time we ran our invoice approval for DMS Workshop, and I can see that over here. So let's go to where that is. You can see I've got two of these because one was completed and one was canceled. So let's take a look at that slice of the wedge. So then if I click onto this, it shows me all of those workflows into there. And then because I have visibility to these, I can expand those and I can see those activities. So in this case, this was canceled at the first activity. And when I go to my second one here, I can see at what point this was completed. So I can see all the audit record of this because I was an initiator for these workflows. I'm also a system administrator, so I got access to those. I'm also the cabinet owner, so I got access to those. And I was a workflow participant, so I got access to those. So under all those circumstances, this status report will be able to be queried and be able to pull into this. So it's nice to have this as a summary as the workflow dashboard. And of course, you can adjust these as you need to. So if you wanted to, expand or contract the period that you want to get that visual on, you can absolutely do that. We then also have the queryable workflow status report. So the workflow status report I was showing you in our last session, when we just click on the workflow section and see what's currently active or canceled or completed workflows, that's a list that's generated automatically. You don't have to do any querying to it. Sometimes, though, you want to be able to search your workflows. And that's where we can use this. We can show our filter options, and we can see there's a lot of different filters into this. Workflow status equals. Remember that all of our documents will either have pending, not submitted for approval, pending approval, approved, not approved, approval postponed. Those are all captured into here. But I also have a status of completed, which includes reviewed and approved. I have canceled if I've axed out the process. Then I have reviewed and pending review. So again, those two other review statuses that I have into there. So any of those statuses can then be queried. So if I want to see any of the workflows that were canceled, I can use that as an action and query my list of all the workflows that I have visibility to. Remember, I have visibility to everything. Your users only have visibility to the ones to which they were an observer, to which they were a participant, or to which they were an initiator. Completed between. Percentages of activities completed. Remember, if one person completes a workflow task and there's two people in the activity, we are still at 0% for that activity. It's only once the activity is completed does this completed percentage move up. Date when the workflow was started, so when we kicked it off. When it's due, again, we can use that as captured dates, a from and between, so we can see a range of those dates. Document name contains, so the documents that went into workflow, their name contains a particular value. What the workflow name contains, maybe you want to search by workflow name, you can absolutely do that. Who initiated the workflow? Workflow template name contains. Remember, we can do custom naming on our workflows, so these are not necessarily the same field. If I'm looking for an invoices in the template, I can use that as my search parameter. Document schema is. Maybe we've got different schema going on here, and I can open this up and I can choose what the schema is that the document went through for its workflow process. Current participant activity is. So current activity participant is Chris Oliver because I'm the one who's using it, but I could choose another user out of here that might be the participant in that particular task. Current activity overdue or due in X number of days. So I can say, this is 10 days overdue and just show me those workflows. Workflow activity contains either approvals or reviews, or maybe it's an external signature. That's a good reminder for me. I'm going to talk about that in a moment, so I'm just going to put a pin in that for now. But external signature is another option that we haven't explored fully yet. Workflow GUID or GUID or GUID, different ways of pronouncing it. So the workflow GUID equals a value. Remember, all of our workflows have a GUID to them. Sometimes they're rather elaborate. I'll show you an example of that in a few moments. Workflow task GUID equals document ID equals. So if I have to know the document ID for it. Now let's head back to our library for a moment. So I'm just going to click on my FileHold button up here, and we'll go and we'll take a look at our reviews and approvals. Let's take a look at our standard status report, and we'll take a look at some of our activities into this. We don't see the GUID in these ones here. If I go to my details, I don't think I see it there. That just shows me my activities into this. Where I'll see the GUID is when I actually see it from an administration report point of view. So we'll go back to our full administration. We'll go over to our administration reports, document usage log, and let's just apply the filter so we can see what's happening to here. These are examples of workflow GUIDs. So this one here is my GUID for this one, and clicking on that will bring up my status report that shows that this was a canceled workflow. So I can see that information into there. So if I happen to know that GUID, and by the way, when I say know the GUID, I mean if I happen to know what the value of that might have been, then I can always, I can capture this, I can search for it, I can use it as a value to further validate my workflows later on. So we can see that I've got lots of different GUIDs here that are associated with different workflow processes. All right, last thing I want to talk about here before we wrap up today is integration with third-party signature software. When we get to session 6, I'm going to show you what FileHold does for a sign-off sheet, but there's also an option to connect FileHold to third-party signature applications. In this case, DocuSign is the one that we are selling right now. So we have a connector built into the software. It's no customization involved, although there's a bit of configuration to do, that allows you to connect your workflow to a DocuSign product. So let's go back up here to workflow management. Let's have a quick look at down in the library configuration. We'll take a look at our workflow templates. There we go. We'll take a look at our process here. So you'll have noticed that when we got to our stages here, we had the option to, with any of our activities that's an approval activity, to send this to, in addition to convert main documents to PDF, we can also pass this out to a third party, and that's an option that we have in here. We can allow this to go for external signature. Now we build that into the template, and then we connect that through, FileHold's team can help out with that to connect it to DocuSign. So the last activity will pass this document out to DocuSign to get someone to do the approval. And that's this, where is it up here? Require supplemental authentication. We can use that tool. Convert main documents to PDF. We can use that tool. We can pass this out to get signed off through DocuSign. So if I need to send this to a third party who isn't a FileHold user and I need a wet version of a signature on it, I can use the DocuSign integration in the existing workflow module. We consider that to be a little bit more of a customized element, so that's why I'm not introducing it here, but I did want to mention it as a very important tool for making sure that you can get that third-party signature onto this if you want to. We'll take a look at what FileHold does for sign-off sheets when we get to session 6 that will be coming up.